Hello, it's another text message prompt for today's episode of 1 Year On, but it isn't a text exchange that occurred between me and Mr. C. It's one that occurred between my mum and I, and it didn't happen a year ago today, but it was a screenshot that Mr. C sent me after he'd been looking through my phone. You'll remember from the earlier episodes that Mr. C decided he was going to keep my phone and I was to have his. This meant that he had access to my old messages. Not that he hadn't always had access to them, and whilst I couldn't be 100% sure, I'm pretty certain he checked my phone when I wasn't around. But I had nothing to hide, so I certainly wouldn't have picked a battle with him over violating that boundary, as the chance of accusations and intimidation and threats would have been highly probable. And that right there, that's coercive control in a nutshell. The fear of doing something for the repercussions, despite it might be that your boundary is a healthy and normal one. The irony with all the accusations and what I now know to be a classic case of projection was that it was Mr. C who had been the one to leave his partner and declare his love and move in with me all in the space of 1 week. We didn't have an affair, but as anyone who has experienced it, the love bombing phase is very fast paced. And after he got wind of me and my husband's separation, he really upped his game in his pursuit of me. He led me to believe that him and his girlfriend's relationship had been on the rocks for some time, and that they had already had conversations about separating, and it was just because he didn't have anywhere to live that it hadn't been made formal. The truth was, it came as a huge shock to his ex that he was leaving, and she was mortified that he had been so blatant in his pursuit of me in their local pub. She kept a dignified silence as the rumour mill went into overdrive, and she's a lovely, kind and patient lady who was set free at the perfect time for her. She suffers with MS, and I'm fairly certain Mr. C had something to do with the constant state of stress that caused it to flare up. Since he left her, she's in a new relationship, her MS is 10 times better, and she has had her first baby, which is just wonderful. The impact abusive relationships has on those around us can be pretty difficult to digest, and I know I've struggled with guilt when it comes to how my actions have impacted others. The messages that prompted this episode were sent 6 months earlier and during my second retreat to my parents' house, which was my first attempt to leave Mr. C. I say it was my first attempt to leave because the time before this I hadn't even considered leaving. The first time, it had been my daughter's 5th birthday, and in what I now know to be true narcissistic style, Mr. C had sabotaged it. The memory of the days leading up to her birthday are pretty hazy, but I know that work stress was supposedly causing Mr. C to struggle with his mood and temper. It was at least 2 days of tension before the inevitable row ensued, and that had lasted the whole day before my daughter's birthday. I was still full of attempts to resolve whatever problems we were facing and express my frustration at this continuous cycle of rows that seemed to go nowhere and solve nothing. We had been together nearly 3 years, and these highly dramatic outbursts, which were utterly crazy, were an almost monthly event. For a long time, it was my menstrual cycle that was blamed, and I had visited the doctors under Mr. C's instruction to discuss the possibility that I was suffering from PMDD. This is premenstrual dysphoric disorder, and it's when you experience extreme premenstrual symptoms and mood swings before your period. I wasn't suffering from PMDD. And so, when we woke on my daughter's birthday, he was still in an awful mood and being less than respectful of me or the fact it was my daughter's birthday. I had slept on the sofa and attempted to placate him with a cup of tea in bed, desperate for my daughter to have the birthday she deserved. It was still very early in the morning, and he had flown out of bed and gone to the kitchen to roll a cigarette, still disgusted with my cheek the day before. I went in with his tea and sat down, pleading with him to calm down and put a happy face on. I said the wrong thing, and he unleashed once again. He got in my face, and not for the first time I pushed him away. But as he came back towards me, I did do something I hadn't done before. I hit him. I hit him hard, and I cut his lip. I couldn't believe it. I had never hit anyone in my entire life, and he instantly started rolling around on the floor like a child, looking at me like he was scared and holding his face. This was a man that used to go looking for bar brawls in his youth, and he took great pleasure in recounting the stories of the tussles he had been in. He then got up and started walking around in a crazy fashion, saying that he was going to ring the police and have me removed. He grabbed his phone, and I begged him not to and told him that I was sorry. He walked off with his phone, and I sat at the kitchen table and I just cried. What had my life become? What had I become? What was my daughter living with? He came back in after a few minutes and sat down to tell me that he had decided against calling the police, but had instead phoned my sister, who was on her way to collect me. He had come back into that room a different man, calm, level, and the erratic, scared and angry man that he was before was nowhere to be seen. I took my daughter her breakfast, putting on a brave face and explaining that we would open her presents when she got home from school. My mum and my sister arrived fairly soon, and my mum went upstairs with my daughter to get her ready for school, whilst my sister, Mr. C and I stayed in the kitchen, and she asked what had happened. I should probably just add in that my sister is a doctor who works in a mental health hospital. He sat with a piece of damp kitchen roll on his lip and told her that I needed help and that she would have to take me away. I literally could not believe what I was seeing and hearing. It was like a different person had been transported into that seat. I went with my mum and my sister, and we took my daughter to school and went over to my mum's house, where I stayed for a couple of days. I was no longer isolated. Whilst they didn't have all the information about our relationship by any stretch, they knew me. They knew I wouldn't have hit Mr. C for no reason, and they knew that whatever was going on wasn't healthy. So, these text messages, they were sent less than a month after this event, and I was back at my mum and dad's again, and this time I'd actually made a conscious attempt to leave him. I certainly hadn't processed that time before, and I'd accepted full responsibility for the whole thing after lashing out, but he had continued to use it as an example of how unhinged I was and what a problem I was. So, as the tension was building again, instead of allowing the same thing to happen, I walked out and I told him that it wasn't good for any of us and I needed space to work out what was going on. He hadn't taken this well, and as you can see from the message I sent to my mum, I didn't know what to do. He was sending me awful messages and threatening to harm himself. I asked his friend to call him to try and calm him down, but the truth was it was all for show, this time. My family were well and truly involved now, and whilst I was away from my home, something very strange happened. I will share more on that in its own episode, as the realisation that maybe all was not what it seems was starting to become more and more into focus. It would be some months before the picture really started to reveal itself, but I left my parents that time feeling supported by them. I would leave another 5 times before escaping for good, but knowing that I had the love and support of my family no matter what happened created a big shift inside me. I know how fortunate I am to have had a loving and supportive family to help me through this chapter of my life, and I know that others don't have the same kind of support network. The importance of support cannot be underestimated, and whilst in an ideal world that support may come from trusted friends or family members, reaching out to other survivors is an incredibly useful thing too. It's also important that those who are supporting you give you the time and space to come to your own realisation, as too much direction or involvement can push a victim into further isolation, as the confusion around who is right, the support network or the abuser, becomes too difficult to process. If you are listening to this and you are unsure as to whether your relationship is abusive, or you are a survivor who would like to support other survivors who may have been through similar to me and you, then please contact me, as the more of us who share our message and step into our power to support others and raise awareness, the less domestic abuse will be accepted as a normal part of society. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on notifications and continue to follow the 1 Year On series. Have a lovely day. Bye bye.